9,843rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is identical letters dated 19 January 2016 from the Permanent Representative of Colombia to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General and the President of the Security Council. S/2016/53. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Colombia to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome His Excellency Mr. Luis Gilberto Murillo, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Colombia. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefer to participate in this meeting. Mr. Carlos Ruiz Massieu, Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of the United Nations Verification Mission in Colombia. Mr. Diego Tovar, Representative of the High Contracting Party to the Commission for the Follow-up, Promotion and Verification of the Implementation of the Final Agreement. And Mr. Armando Uryu Valbuena, Special High-Level Body on Ethnic Peoples of Colombia. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2024/968, the report of the Secretary General on the United Nations Verification Mission in Colombia. And I now give the floor to Mr. Carlos Ruiz Massieu. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, I would like to begin by expressing my best wishes to you at the start of a new year that will certainly demand redoubled efforts to consolidate peace in Colombia. It is an honor to be joined by Foreign Minister Luis Gilberto Murillo. I am pleased also that Diego Tovar is able, once again, to address the Council in today's session, representing the other signatory party of the agreement. The presence of representatives of both the government and the former FARC-EP reflects their continued commitment to an implementation process that requires their active cooperation. I also look forward to hearing the perspective of Armando Valbuena from the Special High-Level Instance of Ethnic Groups, IAMPE, on the challenges of implementation of the ethnic chapter. Mr. President, as last year drew to a close, Colombians celebrated the 8th anniversary of the peace agreement, taking pride in historic achievements of the peace process, while looking ahead to fresh opportunities to further the cause of peace in 2025. Tragically, the first days of the year have been marred instead by violence. I am deeply saddened by the actions that have bloodied the remote Catatumbo region of northeast Colombia since late last week, claiming dozens of civilian lives, including former combatants, signatories of the peace agreement, as well as local leaders and members of communities. According to numerous reports, many of the victims were individually targeted and killed. The Secretary General issued a statement yesterday evening expressing his deep concern and condemnation of the violence against civilians in Catatumbo. President Petro has announced that he has suspended dialogues with the National Liberation Army, ELN, has traveled to the area of the violence and mobilized government agencies to help those affected. Thousands of persons have been displaced, and there has been an outpouring of appeals from civil society in the region and nationally for an immediate stop to the killing. The bloodshed, the result of an ELN attack in an area presence of a rival armed group known as EMBF, is part of the ongoing confrontation between armed groups and in various areas of the country where there is a limited presence of the state and where they compete for control over illegal economies. I condemn these killings, which are an attack against peace itself. And I call again for armed groups to cease all actions that place at risk the civilian population, including community leaders and peace signatories. I call further for armed groups to permit unhindered access for humanitarian responders. Local teams of the verification mission have assisted in the evacuation of at-risk persons, including ex-combatants, from the areas of confrontation. And UN humanitarian colleagues are offering their supports to the affected population. I would like to acknowledge the dedication of our colleagues on the ground in this area, who from the very outset of the crisis have been doing their utmost to help those in danger and in need. Mr. President, Catatumbo is like many regions of Colombia that are still awaiting the dividends of the 2016 peace agreement in terms of a comprehensive presence of the state that would bring public services, legal economies, development opportunities, and security. It is in the vacuum of state presence that illegal armed groups are fighting for territorial and social control. Implementation of the peace agreement is central as ever to lasting solutions for preventing and resolving the causes of armed conflict. The Secretary General, in his report, acknowledges the strong commitment of the government to the implementation of the peace agreement. Translating the abundant desire for progress into increased results in the period ahead will depend not only on continued political will, but on establishing clear objectives and priorities, safeguarding resources, and overcoming obstacles to coordination. In this regard, I welcome the recent assurance by President Petro that budgets for the peace agreement will be protected despite the currently complex financial climate in the country. The success of the Ministry of the Interior's Rapid Response Plan aimed at accelerating implementation will depend directly upon the availability of resources to deliver. For example, on its promise to speed development and infrastructure projects to regions prioritized in the peace agreement under the newly established territorial pacts. Also in relation to rural reform, which has seen significant progress over the past year, funding will be essential for the adjudication and formalization of land. Mr. President, it is critical to accelerate the implementation of the ethnic chapter of the peace agreement, which focuses on the needs and priorities of Colombia's Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities, including their protection. Too often, They are the most victimized by the violence still plaguing rural Colombia. The Bari and Yucpa are among the populations affected by the violence taking place in Catatumbo, for instance. We are hopeful also that the gender provisions of the peace agreement will move forward more rapidly in their implementation, in synergy with the new National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. This also requires adequate funding, a territorial approach, proactive leadership, and constant engagement with women's organizations. Reintegration continues to be an inspiring example of how peace is changing the lives of former combatants and communities. I was able to appreciate this 2 weeks ago when I visited the territorial area for training and reintegration of Tierra Grata in the department of Cesar. Former combatants demonstrated various achievements in the reintegration so far, such as the construction by their own means of over 70 permanent dwellings and the productive projects such as the shoemaking factory and a road paved together with a nearby community. In places where ex-combatants are living all around the country, significant challenges are yet to be addressed to ensure that the projects are sustainable, housing is improved, and security guaranteed. Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, with regard to the process of transitional justice, it must be recognized that progress has been achieved by the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. This includes indictments, unprecedented indictments of 158 individuals considered to be those mainly responsible for serious crimes committed during the conflict, as well as their findings and their contributions to the truth. Nevertheless, it is still a source of concern that there are disagreements between the jurisdiction and those appearing before it with regard to the schedule and the scope of the proceedings. It is fundamental to continue with a constructive dialogue in order to achieve common visions and solutions that will make it possible to satisfy the rights of the victims and guarantee legal certainty for those participating in the process. The mission will continue to offer its good offices to the parties to this end. The just demands of the victims require a response which includes a broad panoply of instances, which includes but is not limited to the SJP. The SJP is called upon to play a special role as a transitional tribunal whose success will be determined by its capacity to contribute to both justice and to peace. If it manages to strike this delicate balance, the jurisdiction will consolidate its historic legacy, both for Colombia and for the world. This year, when we hope that finally the first sanctions issued by the jurisdiction will come about, there will need to be a decisive commitment and the active involvement of relevant entities of the state in order to establish the conditions for their implementation. Amongst the key actors are the Ministries for Defense and Justice, the Agency for Reincorporation and Unity for the implementation of the agreement. The allotment of the resources necessary will be an indispensable condition to achieve this goal. It is important to bring about effective coordination between the jurisdiction and the government. The demonstration by the state of its capacity for implementation, beginning with its own initial sanctions being issued, is fundamental for the success of the transitional justice process and for the agreement in general.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council. Over the past few years, Colombia has clearly demonstrated its commitment to dialogue as the most constructive way of addressing differences and resolving armed conflicts. The United Nations can only agree with that approach as a matter of principle. At the same time, The latest events in Catatumbo show us that any violence against civilians is unacceptable and can be devastating not only to the victims, but also to the very environment for peace talks. Violence erodes trust and legitimacy among the parties, communities, and public opinion at large. That is essential for any peace process to succeed. With respect to the various dialogue processes underway in Colombia, moments of crisis are also moments of opportunity for reflection and adjustments where needed. For some time now, there have been calls from many sectors that, on the one hand, armed actors in dialogue should firmly commit to respect international humanitarian law, and on the other hand, the dialogue efforts should be accompanied by effective security strategies that focus on prevention and the protection of communities. I am sure that the government is constantly analyzing the situation and that it will seriously consider these calls while maintaining its willingness to pursue dialogue. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, I would like to conclude by reiterating the centrality of the 2016 final peace agreement as the core instrument for consolidating peace across the country. Only by fully and deeply implementing the agreement, bringing a comprehensive presence of the state to the long marginalized areas, can the country expect to overcome the factors that continue to foster conflict. This year is an important window for Colombians to continue to work together to advance peace as a strategic national objective. It is also crucial, and a crucial opportunity for the Council to maintain its unanimous support and solidarity for this historic peace process. I have no doubt that it will do so, and I greatly appreciate its support for the verification mission. I thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. Ruiz Massieu for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Diego Tovar.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for this opportunity to participate in the meeting under Rule 39 of the Rules of Procedure of the Council in order to speak about recent developments in the implementation of the peace agreement in the light of the quarterly report of the Secretary-General on Colombia. It's an honor to be at this meeting with the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Luis Gilberto Murillo, and I'd like to thank him for protecting the bilateral nature of the peace agreement and make it possible for me to appear regularly as a representative of the High Contracting Party. Dear Armando Valbuena, we admire your commitment to the ethnic peoples and we share fully with you the contributions that you'll be making to this meeting. I'd like to thank the Council, to the Mission for Verification and its Special Representative, Carlos Ruiz Massieu, for their unanimous support and quarterly reports over the last 8 years. Thank you to the guarantor countries, the Republic of Cuba, the Kingdom of Norway, and special thanks go to the victims of the conflict following the meeting today. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, we've changed the order of our intervention given the serious and recent violent events in Colombia. As was detailed by the Special Representative of the Secretary-General, in the last 6 days alone, in the region of Catatumbo, more than 80 people have been assassinated. 100 were kidnapped, and more than 30,000 have been displaced. This violence is threatening to spread to other regions. The humanitarian crisis that we are seeing is the largest that we've seen in Colombia since we signed the peace agreement. That's why we would like to embrace Catatumbo and dedicate these words in this meeting to them today, in tribute to the memory of the victims. It continues to be the communities and the ethnic peoples, women, farming communities and former combatants, those that signed the peace agreement, that are the most affected by the reconfiguration of the armed actors. all of them in dialogue with the national government. The impunity is very high with regard to assassinations of former combatants and reaches the level of 90% according to the United Nations. We're also seeing similar things happen with regard to assassinations of social leaders. We have supported dialogue as being essential to building peace and as a historic opportunity to achieve the aspirations of the Colombian people. However, in any process of dialogue, the security of the civilian population must be guaranteed. As we've been pointing out over the last 2 years, total peace must mean implementing the protocols of international humanitarian law at the same time as developing security measures that are provided for in the agreement. The comprehensive security system and the policy for dismantling armed organizations that are attacking the civilian population and against the implementation of the final agreement, those things have still not been developed due to a lack of coordination between institutions and because of limited funding. If the way that we implement the total peace agreement is not changed, it will become a serious risk for the implementation of the peace agreement. We welcome the communiqué issued yesterday by the Secretary-General, and we join in his call. Mr. President, members of the Council, the Rapid Response Plan, the name itself shows you that it's an urgent plan, was presented to the Council 3 months ago with the main aim of recovering interinstitutional coordination that was lost under this administration, linking together the entities and bodies that were created for this purpose, such as the Ethnic Instance and the Women's Instance, and the Follow-up Committee. Today, as a high contracting party, we have not heard anything about the goals and progress of these bodies and the way that things are going to be implemented. Therefore, we don't know whether these bodies will be able to meet the goals of the framework plan for implementation, which is the roadmap for the agreement and which has recently been updated between the parties. It's urgent that we strengthen interinstitutional coordination of the agreement and strengthen the presence of the state in the regions. Mr. President, we are concerned that the ethnic chapter of the peace agreement will be one of the areas where the least progress is made. Without repeating what was said by the Secretary, will be said by the Secretariat of the Ethnic Instance in Colombia, 60% of the people affected by violence belong to ethnic peoples. Additionally, almost 3,000 people, that's 25% of the former combatants who signed the peace agreement, have an ethnic identity, and their process of reintegration is not making progress. We must make more progress on the ethnic chapter, work with the ethnic instance and show results. President, distinguished members of the Council, with regard to the special jurisdiction for peace, at the mid-term of its planned activities, it has not issued a single sentence and has not given any certainty with regard to handing down any sentences in the short term. The jurisdiction has an expansive maximalist interpretation of its mandate. Every judge has a different methodology without taking into account an institutional decision and a homogeneous approach to the restorative procedure. It doesn't recognize the selection criteria in the agreement that were formulated by the FARC-EP and the public forces. And it's rare that they rule out criminal prosecution of those that weren't the main people responsible. There are former combatants that continue to be jailed following the signing of the agreement. We've identified a weakness in the jurisdiction in terms of equal treatment when it comes to investigations, and we question its capacity to bring to trial those that are principally responsible for the armed conflict. Once again, we ask the jurisdiction to return to the peace agreement that created it and respect its mandate, and we ask our counterpart, the state, to assist this process. Mr. President, members of the Council, 8 years on, the process of reintegration remains precarious. Its non-implementation and the persistent violent actions have led to 80% of former combatants leaving their territorial areas. 2023 and 2024 were difficult years. we saw massive displacements of the signatories. Today, 76% of the signatories are unemployed, and for 2 months the budget for reintegration has been suspended. These territorial spaces or areas that the President Petro called concentration camps in this same council continue to wait for rapid action. The state of Colombia has to stand by the thousands of former combatants who voluntarily laid down their arms 8 years ago for a process of reintegration. Finally, rural reform. In 3 months, the rapid response plan has still not filtered down to the local level, and insecurity in regions is an obstacle to its implementation. The unjust distribution of land is one of the fundamental causes for the conflict. In order to address this, the agreement provides for the formalization of lands for the benefit of farmers, rural women and victims. But progress has not been sufficient. We need adequate funding to achieve its goals. We also hope at better articulation with Chapter 4 of the agreement with regard to the substitution of illegal crops. It's a key program. If it's not implemented, then armed groups will be able to control these illicit economies and strengthen their actions that affect these communities. In conclusion, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, I would like to express in particular my gratitude to the Council for your constant and decisive support for our peace, the successful implementation of which depends on building facts on the ground and not just giving speeches. And this has been made clear regularly by our representative, Rodrigo Lodoño. We are convinced that with manifest goodwill and the valuable assistance of the Council to Colombia, despite our adversity, peace will prevail.
I thank Mr. Diego Tovar for his briefing. And now give the floor to Mr. Armando Uriu Valbuena. You have the floor, sir.
Muy respetado, señor presidente.
Your Excellency, Mr. President, and Your Excellencies, members of the Security Council, greetings. Also to the Foreign Minister of Colombia, Mr. Diego Tovar, and Special Representative, Mr. Carlos Ruiz Massieu. In representation of the ethnic peoples of Colombia, please accept our thanks for assisting us in recent years in the efforts of our country to achieve peace. Ethnic peoples constitute 10% of the Colombian population, and we live collectively, we occupy a third of national territory, represented mainly by riches in jungles, water resources and biodiversity. As such, we are environmental guardians for the rest of Colombians and for the planet. This environmental characteristic represents to a large extent the essence of how we see ourselves as collective peoples and communities of African descent and indigenous of the various groups that make up Colombia. In the negotiation of the peace agreement in Havana, in Cuba, we were the only stakeholder, social actor, to sit down and conclude an agreement with the Colombian government and the former FARC. And this is what led to the ethnic chapter, which we agreed upon. And we said that it would be a first in the history of peace agreements, given that it would have an ethnic perspective applied to all contents of the final peace agreement. For the representation of indigenous peoples communities, it was agreed that there would be a mechanism known as the Instance of Ethnic Peoples, the IEANPE. And I am speaking to you as head of this body, monitored as I am by a council of 8 men and women of the various ethnic groups. Today, after 8 years of implementation of the agreement, the ethnic chapter continues to be the most left behind, neglected. The current government in 2023 set itself the goal of 60% for fulfillment of the ethnic chapter. And when its term in office comes to an end in the middle of 2026, through the Pact for the Implementation of the Ethnic Chapter, a measure which tried to solve the level of underdevelopment for communities of African descent and indigenous communities. And also, last year, it presented a rapid response plan that would, in general, speed up the pace of implementation. Nevertheless, despite all of this, the provisions of the ethnic chapter are not included either in the rapid response plan or in the planned territorial pacts. Mr. President and members of the Council, in any event, the conditions for a substantive improvement in the pace of implementation mean that the instances provided for in the agreement must be activated by the various stakeholders in peace. For example, the Committee on the Follow-up and Monitoring of Implementation is an inactive body, but it has the potential of bringing together representatives of the Colombian state, the signatories of the peace agreement of the now extinct FARC, the FARC, the international community, the gender instance, and the ethnic peoples high-level instance, IENPE. It's also important that the ethnic peoples instance be recognized as a national interlocutor by the various stakeholders involved in the implementation of the peace agreement for these tasks of coordination and supported in this task so that it can fulfill its mandate. Currently, the resources that we have are not sufficient for the tasks that we have to do. On the other hand, we would ask the Colombian state to include us in the 16 national sectoral plans for comprehensive rural reform and development plans. But we can't so far see any impact of these programs in our areas. I'm speaking to you in the Catatumbo area, which borders with Venezuela, and former combatants and my brothers from the Bayi people are victims of, some of them of displacement and others of confinement. The latter, however, have welcomed in their territories hundreds of farming families, and they require urgent humanitarian assistance. The situation brought about by the conflict is not just seen in Catatumbo. It's in other areas of Colombia as well, in Chocó and the Pacific coast. It's in the forest areas as well, where peoples and communities, ethnic communities, are the ones being most affected. Amongst them, leaders of the special consultation mechanisms. We therefore ask that the National Commission for Security Guarantees take another look at the issue and include in this strengthening of the collective self-protection mechanisms as are foreseen in the final peace agreement. Finally, we would like to highlight that support for the ethnic chapter and the high-level instance for ethnic peoples, YAMPI, and the verification mission of the United Nations mission in Colombia that accompanies us, led by the United States and Mexico. Presidents, members of the Security Council, thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Valbuena for his briefing. I now give the floor to the members of the Council. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Carlos Ruiz Hernandez, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Panama.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, once again, we'd like to thank the presidency of this council for leading our work, and we warmly welcome Foreign Affairs Minister Luis Gilberto Murillo to this session, showing us once again the very high-level commitment of their country with the advance in the process of building stable peace in Colombia, our brotherly country. We would like to thank the briefers for their interventions. They were very informative. But firstly, I'd like to begin our intervention by referring to the terrible events in Catatumbo, leading to more than 80 deaths, 20 injured, and thousands of people displaced. Panama expresses our deep solidarity with the victims and their families as we call for a ceasefire that will last and that will be verifiable, that will ensure that human rights are protected and the communities and those that signed the peace agreement are protected. Panama recognizes the efforts of the government of Colombia to consolidate and implement the peace agreement over the last 8 years. Colombia undoubtedly is an example of political willingness, and a constructive spirit in dialogue by all parties is essential in order to restore the social fabric of a state. Thanks to their political will and assistance from the United Nations system and the verification mission of the UN in Colombia, led by Special Representative of the Secretary General, Carlos Ruiz Massieu, the Security Council is able to proudly state that this process, despite the political complexities over time, is a hopeful process, and hopefully Colombia will be able to consolidate peace and security throughout its territory. We take note of the Secretary General's report of the verification mission in Colombia, pursuant to Resolution 2754 of 2024, on all of the progress made in the implementation of the agreement under the following pillars: rural reform, the ethnic chapter, and the general provisions. With regard to these pillars, we would like to make the following comments. For Panama, as a signatory to the Compact on Women, Peace and Security, the recognition and guarantee of the rights of women and girls and their role in maintaining peace in the reconstruction process post-conflict is fundamental. That's why we view very positively the recent plan of action presented by the Colombian government under Resolution 1325, the first national strategy for women, peace and security. We also take note of the concern expressed by the parties that have reaffirmed their desire to see sped up and greater impetus given to progress on the implementation of the agreement. We also recognize the difficulties in its implementation, and that's why we would respectfully call on the special jurisdiction for peace to speed up its work. The victims need a closure, and this is something that we've heard in the meeting today. We also welcome the efforts on the implementation of the peace agreement. We recognize its complexities on the ground, and we appreciate the initiatives for dialogue. We express, however, our concern because in some regions near the Panamanian border, disputes continue between armed groups and clashes with the Colombian public security forces following the suspension and non-renewal of the so-called ceasefire. The civilian population is the most affected, in particular our indigenous peoples on both sides of the border. We are also concerned about the reports on the increase in recruitment of children and the use of anti-personnel landmines, as well as the effects of the conflict on the civilian population. In this regard, Panama reiterates, as it is stated in the peace agreement itself, that the protection of victims and civilians must continue to be at the heart of any efforts to resolve the conflict in Colombia. We call upon all the parties involved to meet their obligations under international humanitarian law, ensuring the protection of civilians with regard to the effects of the conflict. We also would like to refer to the OCHA report on the displacement of 176,609 people, 128,459 of them in individual events and 48,150 in mass events, and the confinement of 138,795 people in 17 departments and 77 municipalities. It's important to stress that in situations of conflict, those displaced by force and in a situation of irregular migration face significant threats given their vulnerability, particularly from transnational criminal networks. These networks benefit from their vulnerability, and they can be exploited through human trafficking, illicit trafficking in migrant persons, forced labor, or sexual exploitation. The link between conflicts and transnational organized crime not only exacerbates humanitarian crises, but also perpetuates cycles of violence and poverty, defying international efforts to guarantee human rights and the security of these populations. President, allow me to conclude expressing the firm support of my delegation to the work of the Special Representative and his good offices to promote the application of the peace agreement and for the political dialogue between the government and various armed groups, and also reiterate our support to the government of the Brotherly Republic of Colombia in their search for sustainable peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Carlos Ruiz Hernandez for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank SOSG Ruiz Massieu, Mr. Tovar, and Mr. Wariu Valbuena for briefing us today. I also warmly welcome Foreign Minister Murillo to the Chamber. The United Kingdom welcomes the Colombian government's renewed focus on implementation of the 2016 peace agreement and the rapid response plan presented to the Council last year. Coordinated action between government agencies and regional authorities, as well as sufficient resourcing, will be critical to its success. In that light, we welcome President Petro's recent commitment to ensure that funding for implementation of the peace agreement is maintained despite broader government budget cuts. As highlighted by Mr. Wariu Valbuena, there must be continued focus on progress for the most conflict-affected groups, particularly indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities. The United Kingdom was delighted to see the publication of Colombia's first ever Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan. This will be an important tool to reinforce implementation of the 2016 agreement and wider gender goals. It also serves to shine a much-needed spotlight on the violence that women and girls continue to face. We are, however, concerned by the rise in child recruitment and the use of anti-personnel mines. We urge the government to prioritise the security of all vulnerable communities. Transitional justice is at the heart of the 2016 agreement. The UK urges the government and the Special Jurisdiction for Peace to work together to accelerate sentencing and restorative justice measures, maintaining the confidence of both the victims and the signatories to the agreement. President, we condemn the violence between the Ejército de Liberación Nacional and the Estado Mayor Central in Catatumbo on 16 January, which left over 80 dead, including signatories to the 2016 agreement, and which displaced approximately 18,000 people. These barbaric actions, which follow a string of attacks on the Colombian security forces and widespread oppression of communities, further call into question the ELN and EMBF's interest in dialogue and desire for peace. They must end this behaviour and make clear to the Colombian people their commitment to dialogue to give this political process any chance of success. Let me conclude by underscoring the United Kingdom's resolute commitment to support Colombia along its path to sustainable peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom, and I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to thank SRSG Carlos Luis Maciel for his informative briefing and commend him and his team for their efforts in assisting the Colombian government for the implementation of the 2016 peace agreement. I would also like to welcome the briefings by Mr. Diego Tovar and Mr. Valbuena. I welcome Foreign Minister Luis Gilberto Murillo to this meeting. The Minister's presence here today is a testament to the Colombian government's continued commitment not only to the peace agreement of 2016, but also to the cause of improving the lives and livelihoods of the Colombian people. Mr. President, peace embodies more than mere absence of conflict. It is about creating conditions that prevent the resurgence of violence by providing justice, ensuring safety, improving livelihoods, and building a social and economic edifice that caters to the needs of the people without any distinction or discrimination. Recently, Colombia marked the 8th anniversary of the signing of the final peace agreement of 2016. This agreement represents the collective desire of the Colombian people not only to bring an end to the decades-long conflict, but also their aspirations for a better future. Mr. President, I commend all stakeholders and parties to the peace agreement for their patience and perseverance in staying the course despite multiple challenges and setbacks. We commend the Colombian government's efforts to speed up the implementation of the peace agreement, inter alia through a rapid response plan. We also congratulate Colombia for launching the first national action plan on women, peace and security. We hope that this plan would achieve its stated goals and objectives. Mr. President, the government's emphasis on achieving comprehensive rural reforms by inter alia ensuring equitable land distribution for the benefit of local populations is commendable and will help in alleviating poverty and improving the livelihoods of the common people, as well as establish and expand state control in hitherto ungoverned spaces. The continued violence against former combatants of FARC, social leaders and human rights defenders is an issue of concern. We remain particularly concerned about the targeting of indigenous people, Afro-Colombians, and the peasants by armed groups, as well as the reports of sexual and gender-based violence against women and children, and the recruitment of children by armed groups. We welcome the Security Council Working Group's visit to Colombia and encourage the Colombian government to consider the Working Group's recommendations for curbing child recruitment. Mr. President, my delegation condemns the recent attacks reportedly perpetrated by members of ELN in Catatumbo. We regret the massive loss of life resulting from this attack, as well as the displacement of local population resulting from this incident. We endorse the statement that was issued by the UN Secretary General on this event. We also take note of the Colombian government's decision to put on hold the dialogue process with ELN. We note the Colombian government's policy of dialogue with various armed groups. We call upon all armed groups to sincerely engage with the government to establish ceasefires at an early date, eschew all forms of violence, and recommit to the process of dialogue without preconditions, respecting local laws and the Colombian Constitution. The provision of justice to the victims of the conflict would go a long way towards ensuring sustainable and lasting peace. Mr. President, Colombia has taken remarkable strides towards ending the conflict in their country. Let me reassure the Colombian government and its people of Pakistan's continued support for the realization of sustainable peace through collective efforts, perseverance, empathy, mutual understanding, and an unwavering commitment to a harmonious future. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation. Please.
Mr. President, we'd like to thank for his briefing the SRSG, Mr. Carlos Ruiz Massieu. We welcome the participation in today's meeting, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Colombia, Mr. Luis Murillo, as well as the representative of the High Contracting Party, Mr. Diego Tovar. We listened very carefully to the civil society briefer, Mr. Armando Valbuena. The peace-building process in Colombia has come up against one of its most serious challenges since the final peace agreement was signed in 2016. The wave of violence in the Catatumbo sub-region has resulted in dozens of victims, including the unprecedented killing of 6 signatories of the FPA. It also led to the largest humanitarian crisis in decades. The ELN and FARC dissident groups should immediately cease hostilities and violence which is affecting civilians. We're counting on timely actions being taken by the authorities and the armed forces so as to restore order in the region. The tragedy that occurred over the last few days brought into sharp relief the key problem of the peace process, that is the lack of security for ex-combatants, social leaders and all victims of the conflict. How can we talk about guarantees for former insurgents when they're being killed by the dozen? Owing to ongoing threats, ex-FARC members, those who opted for peace over weapons, are forced to live in constant fear, to hide and to flee their homes instead of being reintegrated in full. We stand convinced that the agreement's security measures cannot be implemented without a fully fledged state presence across all territories affected by the conflict. For the time being, groups which are formally participating in the dialogue with the authorities, but those who haven't actually laid down their arms, are still in charge there. They represent a growing threat for signatories to the final peace agreement and the victims of the conflict. We commend the endeavor of Bogota to address conflicts through peaceful agreements. However, we said on numerous occasions that negotiations with illegal armed groups should follow clear protocols and principles. Negotiations must be aligned with both the peace-building strategy of the authorities and the priority of implementing the peace agreement. The FPA should remain the bedrock of national reconciliation and post-conflict transformation in Colombia. We understand that, to a large extent, responsibility for its stalled implementation falls on the previous Colombian administration, which outright torpedoed and replaced the implementation of the FPA. By contrast, we've seen President Gustavo Petro and his government committed to implementing the agreement. We see that this objective is top of mind for the authorities. Nonetheless, for the time being, we cannot point to any significant progress. The implementation of the rapid response plan announced by the government in this chamber has not yet begun. For now, we must acknowledge that the pace of the distribution of land, part of the rural reform that's of utmost importance for the Colombian peace-building process, that pace is insufficient. As of year-end 2024, only 6% of the promised 3 million hectares had been transferred. To date, we've seen no headway on implementation of the ethnic chapter. Indigenous persons and Afro-Colombians are disproportionately bearing the brunt of the conflict. The disagreement, which has been ongoing for a long time, about the work of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace remains. We believe that, as per the agreement, this singular transitional justice mechanism should remain independent and autonomous. Having said that, its expected decisions should be timely, providing legal certainty for all parties to the conflict, thereby promoting the restoration of justice and pan-national reconciliation. We believe that, given the current crisis, the UN verification mission should continue to play a constructive role, using its good offices and establishing informal channels of communication between the parties. It goes without saying that this is on the understanding that there is an imperative to ensure the security of the mission's employees and an overarching objective of verifying the implementation of the final peace agreement. On our side, we reassert Russia's commitment to comprehensive assistance being provided to the peace process in Colombia, as well as UNVIC efforts under the leadership of Mr. Carlos Ruiz-Massieu. I thank you.
The representative of Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank Special Representative Massieu for his briefing and commend his leadership of the verification mission. I also wish to express my gratitude to Mr. Valbuena and Mr. Tovar for sharing their insights, and I welcome the Minister Murillo to today's meeting. Mr. President, let me begin by recognizing the commitment of the parties to implementing the agreement and addressing the root causes of the conflict in Colombia. We are encouraged by the recent announcements of the revised framework plan for the implementation of the agreement and the rapid response plan, which, through efficient efforts and adequate funding, have the potential to accelerate the implementation of the agreement, including comprehensive rural reform. Nevertheless, halfway through the timeframe, concerns persist regarding the state of implementation. The Special Jurisdiction for Peace must ensure that, while respecting legal certainty, the goals of delivering justice and contributing to the consolidation of peace in Colombia are met expeditiously for the benefit of victims and survivors. At the same time, the government must promptly take all necessary measures to create the conditions for the implementation of restorative sentences soon to be delivered by the SJP. Mr. President, as witnessed in recent days, another major challenge remains the lack of security guarantees for former combatants, human rights defenders, and social leaders, compounded by the limited states present in the areas previously occupied by FARC. We condemn in the strongest possible terms the killing of civilians in Cantatubo region over the weekend. We are also concerned about the reports of armed clashes between the government and the ELN, which, following the expiration of the ceasefire, have resulted in multiple casualties on both sides and have further negatively affected the civilian population in rural areas. We condemn in particular the increase in the recruitment and use of children by armed groups, as well as the use of anti-personnel mines, especially in the vicinity of schools and hospitals. In this regard, we urge the immediate cessation of violence by all parties, the protection of the civilian population, and safe and unhindered humanitarian access to prevent further displacement of the population. Finally, Mr. President, Slovenia welcomes the adoption of Colombia's first National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. We encourage the government to sustain its political will, allocate sufficient funding to ensure effective implementation, and complement it with the gender provisions of the agreement and ongoing peace dialogues. This will ensure women's full, equal, safe and meaningful participation in all stages of the dialogue, as well as the protection and promotion of their rights. Sexual and gender-based violence, including against children and adolescents, remains a significant protection concern that must be addressed effectively. To conclude, let me use the example of the National Action Plan to highlight the resolve of the Colombian people to ultimately achieve peace in the face of adversity. Indeed, Colombia's efforts to consolidate peace over the years continue to serve as a valuable source of knowledge and experience in peace building for the international community, including in the area of environmental peace building. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Special Representative Ruiz Massieu, High Contracting Party Representative Mr. Tovar, and Mr. Valbueno for their briefings today. And I welcome the participation of Colombia's Foreign Minister Murillo in this meeting. At the end of last year, Colombia celebrated its 8th anniversary of the final peace agreement, a historic agreement which brought to an end and to more than 50 years of conflict. Denmark commends the Colombian people for their determination and their tireless pursuit of peace. Mr. President, allow me to focus on 3 areas. First, violence continues to represent an existential threat to the final peace agreement. Denmark is alarmed by the escalation of violence in the northeast Catatumbo region of Colombia, which killed dozens of people and displaced thousands. We strongly condemn the attacks by the ELN and the EMBF and call for the immediate cessation of hostilities. An urgent humanitarian response is needed to help those in need, and the scaling up of security measures to protect vulnerable groups must be a priority. Denmark is alarmed by the reports of mass displacement and confinement by armed groups, including in the Pacific region, and the increase in the recruitment of children. Women continue to bear the brunt of the insecurity, particularly sexual and gender-based violence. We strongly condemn the high levels of violence against social leaders, including indigenous and Afro-Colombian leaders. The increasing trend of homicides against leaders in environmental protection and land restitution must be reversed. We are also deeply concerned by the high number of former combatants killed since the signing of the peace agreement, including those killed in recent days. Security challenges continue to hamper the social, economic, and political reintegration of former combatants who laid down their arms for peace. It is crucial to advance the effective implementation of security guarantees. Second, Mr. President, despite these serious challenges, progress has been made. We are encouraged by the government's commitment to advancing the rural reform chapter and progress on land distribution and formalization. We commend the efforts of the government to dismantle illegal armed groups and criminal organizations. We call on the government to expand efforts towards establishing an integrated state presence across conflict-affected areas to protect vulnerable communities. Denmark is also encouraged by the government's commitment to accelerate the implementation of the ethnic chapter. However, as we've heard today again from Mr. Valbueno, challenges remain. We hope to see greater progress and resources allocated to ensure that the benefits of this important chapter are felt by the ethnic communities. Tackling insecurity, which causes further delays to implementation, is key. The women of Colombia played a critical role in shaping this peace process, demanding their rightful place in the discussions that will shape the future of their country. As others here today, Denmark therefore warmly welcomes the launching of Colombia's first National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. We hope this plan will complement the gender provisions in the peace agreement and reinforce women's political participation. The allocation of sufficient budget for 2025 across all of these areas will be vital. Funding is critical for the consolidation of the gains made for the people of Colombia. Mr. President, my third point relates to transitional justice. Denmark commends the progress made by the Special Jurisdiction for Peace to support the victims and survivors of the conflict. We look forward to the prompt issuance of the SJP's first restorative sentences. We underscore the necessity for adequate funding and the necessary security arrangement to be in place to implement these rulings. Legal certainty for individuals under SJP's jurisdiction is critical. Closure helps to consolidate peace, allowing the scars of this conflict to heal. We call for any issues between the SJP and peace signatories to be resolved based on the framework of the peace agreement. In conclusion, Mr. President, let me underscore Denmark's full support to Colombia's peace process, which remains an example to the world. We look forward to supporting Colombia on its path to lasting and sustainable peace during our council term. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Special Representative Carlos Ruiz Massieu, the representative of the High Contracting Party of the Peace Agreement, Mr. Tovar, as well as Mr. Valbuena for the briefings. I also welcome the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Colombia, Mr. Murillo. Mr. President, we are particularly concerned and condemn the recent violence against civilians in the Catatumbo region involving clashes between armed groups that resulted in many casualties and reported mass displacement. We express our full support to the Colombian government and join calls for the immediate de-escalation of the situation with the protection of civilians as the ultimate goal. Mr. President, Greece reiterated its full support to the peace process in Colombia, anchored in the 2016 peace agreement. We commend the Colombian government's total peace agenda, which we consider complementary to the peace agreement, as well as the rapid response plan recently presented by the Colombian government. We acknowledge that the peace process in Colombia seeks to address the root causes of the conflict and the historic injustices. In this respect, we welcome the progress on rural reform, including land restitution to the victim of the conflict, and encourage a continuation of efforts towards achieving the goals set in the 2016 peace agreement. It is noteworthy that rural reform in Colombia incorporates environmental considerations as emphasized during the UN Framework Convention on Biodiversity, COP16, that took place in Cali in October 2024. Rural reform is also linked to the reintegration of ex-combatants, providing them with livelihoods and housing, and enabling their access to education and healthcare services. This integrated approach of land distributions and integrations can contribute significantly to reducing violence and insecurity in rural areas, allowing for increased state presence. At the same time, accelerating the implementation of the ethnic chapter of the peace agreement is crucial to rectify injustices faced by indigenous people and Afro-Colombian population, thus ensuring their empowerment and active participation in public life. We cannot ignore that these populations are particularly affected by child recruitment and use, as well as conflict-related sexual violences. These practices are utterly unacceptable, and the safety and security of children and women must be prioritized. In this respect, we welcome Colombia's first National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, launched in November 2024, and we are confident that it will complement effectively the gender provisions of the peace agreement. Moreover, we appreciate the recent visit of the Security Council Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict to Colombia, which highlights the government's commitment to implementing the CAC agenda. Similarly, the protection of social leaders and human rights defenders from attacks remains an absolute imperative. Greece also recognizes the innovative role of transitional justice in Colombia's peace process and urges a special jurisdiction for peace and the government to take all necessary measures for the swift issuance and successful implementation of restorative sentences respectively. Mr. President, in conclusion, Greece reiterates its unwavering support to the UN verification mission in Colombia and to the Special Representative of the Secretary General, and acknowledges their invaluable contributions to promoting the effective implementation of the peace agreement. On our part, we will remain committed to a Colombian-led and Colombian-owned peace process with the ultimate goal of achieving justice for the victims and survivors of the conflict. I thank you.
Thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana. Yes.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3+, namely Algeria, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and my country, Guyana. We thank SRSG Carlos Ruiz Massieu for his briefing and commend him and the UN Monitoring and Verification Mission team in Colombia for their invaluable work. We have also listened carefully to civil society representative Armando Valbuena. We welcome the participation of His Excellency Mr. Luis Gilberto Murillo, Minister for Foreign Affairs, in today's meeting, and take this opportunity to thank him, and through him, the government and people of Colombia, for their warm hospitality during the visit of the Security Council Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict last month. We also welcome the participation of Mr. Diego Tovar Henao, representative of the High Contracting Party of the Peace Agreement. Mr. President, the A3+ is encouraged by the continued progress in implementing the 2016 peace agreement. Despite some setbacks, we are pleased to note that the positive momentum has continued, and we echo the Secretary General's assessment that Colombia is a valuable source of knowledge and experience in peace building and conflict resolution. the intensification of efforts to advance comprehensive rural reform and boost land adjudication and formalization is a welcome development, even as we recognize there is much more to be done to achieve the target set, especially with respect to adjudication. We also welcome the recent reintegration of 12,000 former combatants. We encourage the relevant authorities to continue developing and implementing measures that enable the sustainable transition of former combatants into society, which is critical to building trust and consolidating peace. While acknowledging ongoing efforts, we see opportunities to accelerate progress on implementing the ethnic chapter of the peace agreement. We encourage the government to redouble its efforts to address impediments to the effective implementation of this chapter and its gender provisions. We note that there has been limited progress on fulfilling the commitments in the pact and hope to see greater progress ahead of the 2026 deadline. We also hope to see an acceleration of progress in collective reparations for ethnic communities, which will no doubt contribute to healing and reconciliation. We are optimistic that the rapid response plan designed to expedite the implementation of the agreement will produce positive outcomes for the ethnic chapter. In this context, the A3+ endorses the idea that the Ministry of Interior's rapid response plan can be enhanced by incorporating provisions related to gender and the priorities of the ethnic chapter. On the issue of the gender provisions of the agreement, the A3+ has taken positive note of the signing of the interinstitutional agreement to promote compliance with the gender provisions and welcomes the launch of the Women, Peace and Security Action Plan. We continue to emphasize the need for adequate funding to be made available to ensure its proper implementation. Mr. President, another fundamental issue of concern for the A3+ is the ongoing recruitment of children by armed groups. The A3+ firmly condemns the recruitment and use of children by armed groups and notes that there has been an increase in this activity over the reporting period. We demand an immediate end to such practices and underscore the need for full adherence to international law. Ensuring accountability for crimes against children is an important step to guaranteeing justice. To this end, we welcome recent efforts to strengthen legal frameworks for child protection in Colombia, including the recent legislation on child marriages and adoption of the Bogota Call to Action. We urge the government to continue these efforts and to prioritize child protection in peace dialogues. Moreover, we remain deeply concerned about high instances of conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based violence, including against children and adolescents in reintegration areas. We emphasize the need for early warning systems to be put in place to identify security risks and facilitate urgent and timely follow-up mechanisms without delay. We acknowledge the updates made to the UN Verification Mission's guidelines on addressing sexual and gender-based violence in line with Resolution 2754, and believe that this will contribute significantly to the effort to address the issue of violence against children comprehensively. Mr. President, another issue of grave concern for the A3+ relates to the ongoing threats and attacks by armed groups, which have led to increased displacement of civilians in different parts of the country and promotes confinement. Indigenous and Afro-Colombians are bearing the brunt of the violence, which continues to impede peace efforts. The A3+ welcomes the recent progress made on the public policy plan to dismantle armed groups and commence the launch of the territorial plan for the policy's implementation in Northern Cauca in December 2024. The approval of the regulations governing the high-level unit of the comprehensive security system for the exercise of politics is an important step in improving coordination. We wish to underline that this must go hand in hand with increased state presence in affected regions. The limited state presence in some territories continues to pose a serious risk to peace efforts and must be addressed as a matter of priority. We also urge the Colombian government to continue its efforts to promote peace through active dialogue with all relevant stakeholders. The A3+ condemns the recent killings of over 80 persons in Catatumbo and remains gravely concerned about the rupturing of the peace talks between the government and the ELN. We recognize Colombia's deep-rooted conviction that dialogue is the only way forward, and we strongly urge the ELN to show renewed proof of its commitment to peace. We commend the progress made by the Special Jurisdiction for Peace and encourage the issuance of the long-awaited sentences. We further reiterate the need for effective coordination between all relevant entities and acknowledge the government's commitment to allocating $20 million this current year and providing additional necessary resources towards this endeavor. The need for legal certainty for those under the jurisdiction of the SJP is paramount. The A3+ acknowledges that the issue of financing is critical to the overall implementation of the peace agreement. We call on the Colombian government and the legislature to ensure the provision of adequate finances and on the international community to support Colombia in this regard. As I conclude, Mr. President, I wish to once again express the firm support of the A3+ to the government and people of Colombia for the implementation of the 2016 peace agreement and reiterate our call for support at all levels to ensure comprehensive implementation. Let me also applaud the work undertaken by the UN verification mission in Colombia during the past year and thank the mission for its continued efforts to support the implementation of the peace agreement. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. SRSG Ruiz Massieu, Mr. Tovar, and Mr. Valbuena, thank you for your presentations, and we welcome Minister Murillo. The United States has proudly supported implementation of Colombia's peace accord since its signing in 2016, and the United States will continue efforts to support a durable and lasting peace in Colombia. The peace accord sought to address conflict-related atrocities and abuses which took place over more than 50 years. However, Colombia continues to experience long-term consequences of conflict. We note the efforts of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace to seek to end impunity for conflict-related crimes and to respond to victims and survivors. We also appreciate the supporting role played by the UN verification mission. We urge the government of Colombia to continue its commitment to attaining justice for victims and survivors of the conflict, including survivors of gender-based violence. Absent these efforts, Colombia will continue to face challenges meeting its security, stability, and counter-narcotics goals. The United States has contributed more than $2.1 billion to support the Accord's implementation. Included in this assistance are more than $125 million to assist Colombia to design and implement development plans in conflict-affected communities. However, more must be done. Many women and young people currently experience great trauma from the ongoing violence they suffer or witness, the effects of which will continue to be felt for some time. Their healing, as well as their full and meaningful participation in peace dialogues, are essential components of a durable, sustainable peace. Women and young people need to be part of the conversation in building a peaceful future in Colombia. The level of conflict-related violence and attacks against former combatants remained high in this reporting period and continues to be a concern. And we want to join the SRSG and other council members in condemning the recent violence in Catatumbo. Likewise, the continued violence against social leaders and human rights defenders is deeply troubling. These crimes not only target the leaders that Colombia needs most in peace-building efforts, but they also have a chilling effect on their communities. Notably, we are pleased to see the Special Jurisdiction for Peace's first indictments issued and advancing its work on gender-based crimes in macro case number 11. The United States remains committed to preventing impunity for criminal acts carried out by terrorists and other illegal armed groups. Past peace processes have made clear that a security strategy is essential to pressure illegal armed groups to negotiate in good faith and to avoid impunity for their abuses. In the 8 years since the final agreement, implementation of the peace agreement and its ability to address Colombia's deteriorating security conditions remains a work in progress. Achieving peace for the sake of all Colombians should remain at the forefront of all involved, including in this very council. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I welcome the presence of Colombian Foreign Minister Murillo at today's meeting. I also thank Special Representative Monsieur, the representative of the Communist Party, Mr. Tovar, for their briefings. I also listened with interest to a statement made by the civil society representative. Over the past year, all parties in Colombia have worked together to consolidate and build peace, translating their resolve into concrete actions and registering positive progress in promoting the peace process. China appreciates those efforts. In the new year, we hope that all Colombians will forge ahead with unwavering confidence, maintain unity, and continue to draft a new chapter of peace, reconciliation, and progress. I would like to share 3 hopes. First, we hope that new improvements will be achieved on the security front. We are concerned about the recent tensions in the Catatumbo region of Colombia and condemn the atrocities of killing civilians. The displacement caused by the conflict is worrisome. China notes that on January the 20th, President Petro declared a state of emergency in response to the escalating armed conflict. We support the Colombian government to step up security deployment and effectively deter violence so as to restore stability as soon as possible, protect the lives of Colombians, alleviate the humanitarian situation on the ground, and enhance protection of vulnerable groups such as former combatants, ethnic minorities, women, and children. Second, we hope that the dialogue and reconciliation process will score new progress. China appreciates the efforts of the Colombian government to resolve the conflict through dialogue and negotiation. We hope that a breakthrough will be achieved in the dialogue at an early date. The peace talks between the government and the ELN have encountered setbacks. We hope that both sides can bridge their differences through dialogue and resume peace talks as soon as possible. We also hope that the peace talks between the government and other armed groups will not be affected. The transitional justice process can play a positive role in achieving fairness and justice and promoting peaceful reconciliation. We hope that the Special Jurisdiction for Peace will issue the first restorative sentences at an early date. Third, we hope that the implementation of the peace agreement will produce new results. China appreciates the efforts of the Colombian government under the leadership of President Petro to prioritize the implementation of the peace agreement, promote rural reform and the reintegration of former combatants, and formulate a rapid response plan to accelerate the implementation of the peace accord. At the same time, the SG's report indicated that the overall progress in land adjudication and formalization continue to fall short of expectation, and that former combatants continue to face livelihood challenges. China encourages the government to scale up investment and enhance policy coordination. We also call on UN entities and international and regional partners to sustain their support to Colombia in consolidating the gains of the peace process. President, China appreciates the unique role played by UNVMC under the leadership of SRSG Monsieur in supporting the Colombian peace process. China supports the mission to further fulfill its mandate, promote the Colombian-led and Colombian-owned peace process, and provide important assistance to the Colombian people in achieving peace and development. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also extend my gratitude to SRSG Carlos Maciel for his comprehensive briefing, and I appreciate the perspectives of Mr. Tovar and Mr. Valbuena. I also welcome Foreign Minister of Colombia, His Excellency Murillo, to this meeting. First and foremost, the Republic of Korea commends the valuable work of the UNVMC, including the SRSG's tireless efforts and good offices. My delegation also recognizes the Colombian government's steadfast commitment to the implementation of the peace agreement, especially as the country celebrated the eighth anniversary of its signing last November. Advances in land reform, the launch of Colombia's inaugural National Action Plan on WPS, and the ongoing peace dialogues highlight the progress made toward lasting peace. At the same time, we acknowledge the challenges that remain. These include delays in implementing land delivery, the ethnic chapter, and the gender provisions, as well as the escalating violence against former combatants and civilians. These issues must be addressed decisively to sustain progress in the peace process. Mr. President, as Colombia moves forward in its peace-building efforts, I'd like to highlight the following points. First, Korea welcomes President Petro's reaffirmation that comprehensive rural reform remains a priority for the government. Given that inequitable land distribution has been a root cause of Colombia's decades-long armed conflict, accelerating the pace of rural reform is crucial for achieving sustainable peace. However, concerns about government budget cuts for 2025 and their potential impact on rural reform initiatives must be addressed. We urge the Colombian government to prioritize resource allocation for rural reform and ensure that budgetary constraints do not hinder other peace-related priorities. To support Colombia's rural reform effort this year, Korea will officially launch projects amounting to nearly $10 million to enhance institutional capacity in the cadastral sector and drive the digital transformation of land information. We hope that these initiatives will yield substantial outcomes, strengthening the foundation for Colombia's rural reform. Second, my delegation recognizes the vital role and achievements of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, SJP, as a cornerstone of Colombia's transitional justice system. However, to fully accomplish its mandate within the established time frame, the SJP must maintain a balance between the scope of its mission and the efficiency. It is critical to provide legal certainty for individuals under its jurisdiction and address victims' needs for justice in a timely manner. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned about recent violation in Catatumbo, which resulted in at least 80 deaths, including 8 peace agreement signatories, as well as kidnappings and massive displacement estimated at over 32,000 people. This led to the suspension of peace talks with the ELN, as well as the declaration of a state of internal commotion and the state of economic emergency by President Petro. Such attacks targeting civilians, former combatants, and social leaders are unacceptable. We urge the ELN to immediately cease all hostilities and demonstrate commitment to peace. At the same time, we call on the Colombian government to take actions to strengthen the state's presence in regions most affected by violence, ensuring comprehensive security measures and protections for vulnerable communities. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, At the outset, I would like to thank the SRSG, Mr. Carlos Ruiz Massieu, for his briefing. I welcome the presence in the chamber of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Colombia, Mr. Luis Gilberto Murillo, and I would also like to thank Mr. Diego Tovar, a signatory of the peace agreement and an ex-FARC combatant, as well as Mr. Armando Valbuena, for his briefing. President, France welcomes the commitment of the Colombian government to implementing the peace agreement. The presence of President Petro here in July 2024 and the participation of the Colombian minister in each council meeting attest to their high-level commitment. These efforts must be encouraged and maintained. On this note, France welcomes the unanimous renewal of the mandate of the UN verification mission in October of last year. This sends a strong signal about the unity of Council members in support of the Colombian authorities. France would also like to welcome the launch of Colombia on the 30th of November of its Women, Peace and Security Plan of Action. Now, we need the government's commitments to translate into concrete changes for the benefit of the people. This requires accelerated implementation of the peace agreement, including the rapid response plan introduced to the Council in October by the Colombian authorities. On this note, I'd like to emphasize 4 points. First, interinstitutional coordination is key for the acceleration of progress. Reinforced coordination within the framework of clearly set out responsibilities, as per the rapid response plan. Second, the reduction of violence and the heightened presence of the state across the entire territory are key factors for the full implementation of the peace agreement. France would like to welcome the Colombian government's efforts aimed at continuing dialogue with armed groups, with the support of the SRSG's Good Officers mission. We staunchly condemn the resumption of violence in Catatumbo involving armed groups. There were over 100 victims, and thousands of people were displaced. We call on all armed groups to end their violent activities. The ceasefire agreements should guarantee the security of all ex-combatants and conflict-affected communities. Children are the main victims of this. Armed groups must release the children they've recruited and cease these practices, which are at odds with international law. France commends the Colombian government's commitment to children's rights. We encourage the government to step up its efforts so as to reintegrate those children who were recruited by armed groups. Third, transitional justice has a crucial role to play on the path to reconciliation. Progress has been made under the auspices of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. I am referring first and foremost to the indictment in November 2024 of 6 ex-FARC leaders involved in recruiting children into their ranks, as well as to the investigation into sexual and gender-based violence underway since November 2023. On this note, I welcome the fact that Colombia hosted the latest conference of the Alliance for the Prevention of Sexual Violence in Conflict in November of last year. The dialogue between the parties should continue for the transitional justice process to make headway. The conditions for the full implementation of restorative justice sentences, when such sentences are handed down, to be implemented. Those conditions must be created. Fourth, rural reform is a key pillar for the development of the country, which is 94% rural. France is an accompanying country under Chapter 4 of the peace agreement. We welcome the progress that's been made, and we will continue providing our full political and financial support to the Colombian government in this area. President, France reiterates its full support to the SRSG and to the UN verification mission in their efforts on the ground and to Colombia on its path to lasting peace. I thank you.
For the statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Luis Gilberto Murillo, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Colombia. You have the floor, sir.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Mr. Amar Benjamar, Permanent Representative of Algeria and President of the Security Council. Mr. Carlos Ruiz Massieu, Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of the UN Verification Mission in Colombia, Mr. Armando Valbuena, Special High-Level Body on Ethnic Peoples of Colombia, and Mr. Diego Tovar, Representative of the High Contracting Party to the agreement, Excellencies, Ambassadors, Permanent Representatives of Member States of the Security Council, and Carlos Ruiz Hernandez, Foreign Affairs Minister of Panama. Welcome to the meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin by thanking you for being here and for the ongoing support that you have provided to Colombia's efforts to consolidate peace and for assisting us along this path with so many challenges, as has been mentioned here, but also a path so full of hope. And as we've always said in this Council, we speak of peace, not of war. We do not engage in war, we build peace. And in particular, I'd like to express thanks for the approval of Resolution 2754 of 2024, whereby the mandate of the verification mission in Colombia was extended until the 25th of October this year. The presence of Mr. Diego Tovar, representative of the High Contracting Party to the Commission for Follow-up, is a strong testimony of the important bilateral nature of the agreement. This is extremely important for dialogue and for coordination in the peace-building process. Excellencies, today I am speaking to you on behalf of the Colombian government. We know that peace is not just a national aspiration, but a legacy that we have built for future generations. But also, we reject the war crimes and the crimes against humanity unreservedly committed by the ELN and the dissident groups of the 33rd Front in Catatumbo. The murder of the signatories to the peace agreement are unacceptable, and we condemn those deaths robustly. We will not rest in the government of Colombia until justice is served for those responsible for these acts of absolute violence against the signatories and against the civilian population. Our solidarity, we express our solidarity with all of the victims. And allow me to be clear. Violence against any Colombian, man or woman, is an affront to the values of our nation. And it's also an affront to the work that the United Nations and its verification mission in Colombia is doing to build peace in our country. That is why we have required of armed organizations that they cease violence and clearly demonstrate their willingness, seriously demonstrate their willingness for peace that can be verified. We suspended peace talks with the ELN because peace requires reciprocity, and we call upon the international community, as has been said today, to join us in this Colombian government position, also the position of the Colombian people. We are always searching for peace through diplomatic means and dialogue, but peace goes both ways. It requires willingness to be shown on the part of all those involved in negotiations. As Mr. Ruiz Massieu said previously, the Colombian people and our government have shown resilience and our commitment to peace. And I have to say that this is the reality. This is the absolute truth, and this can be seen throughout our history. And this week has been no exception. Colombians have hosted those that have been displaced from Catatumbo, and they have helped the victims of violence. And our government has adopted exceptional, extraordinary measures to to ensure that peace and tranquility returns to this part of the country. I know from my own experience that this is the right approach, because when I had to leave my country in 2000 due to violence in order to protect my family and survive those circumstances, I realized that I had an opportunity to work for peace in Colombia, and a lot of others have done that in the country as well. And that's why I'm convinced that Catatumbo is not renouncing peace. Colombia is not renouncing peace. Our people in the most vulnerable communities, up to the leaders fighting every day in our country, are not renouncing peace. We continue to build peace. Our government ministers have put in place a plan to speed up the implementation of the peace agreement led by the Ministry for the Interior. It's a detailed plan which in recent months has made significant progress. Amongst that progress, the inclusion of provisions relating to gender and also provisions relating to ethnic peoples, as well as the signing of 16 territorial compacts in order to promote development programs with territorial emphasis, PDET in Spanish. And we have a lot of hope in those programs. It's also necessary that the SJP, the special jurisdiction, join in these efforts of the Colombian state and speed up progress in defining the legal status of those signatories of the peace agreement arraigned before the court. And it's through instances such as the Commission for the Follow-up, Promotion and Verification of the Final Agreement and all institutions and actors that make up the peace ecosystem in Colombia, through all of that we've been able to reach a point of no return in the implementation of the peace agreement. Total peace is the cornerstone of our commitment to life, and we have to make this a reality. Excellencies, Colombia continues to have a shared dream of a country where peace will not be a privilege but a right. President Gustavo Petro, as head of our government, has adopted a renewed approach to peace. The implementation of the peace agreement of 2016 is the pillar on which we build our policy of total peace. Each ministry, each institution, each community has made its contribution to enable us to reach this point of no return in this process, with lots of successes, but there are obstacles as well. But they are obstacles that we will be able to overcome with optimism. And allow me to tell you about something that I think is essential. The peace process in Colombia, with its challenges and lessons learned, is a global reference. It teaches us that even in the face of adversity that we are seeing today, and that through territorial dialogue we can transform the reality of millions. Peace continues to be our cornerstone commitment. Excellencies, Colombia now today to the international community once again reiterates its what we said in the unilateral declaration of state deposited with the United Nations. We are going to continue to, namely that we are going to continue to implement the final agreement, peace agreement, and the total peace agreement. This is part of our total peace policy. Part of this is the rapid response plan as well, and its implementation. We ask for the ongoing support and unanimous assistance of the international community through the United Nations Security Council to the new measures and guarantees that are being proposed for the implementation of the final agreement. as part of the total peace policy. We would like to recognize the committed work of the verification mission under the guide and leadership of Mr. Ruiz Massieu. We are sure that over the course of this year, we will continue to work together to achieve tangible, verifiable, and high-impact results. And I'd like to take this opportunity to invite you to assist the Republic of Colombia in its noble aspiration to become part of this organ, the Security Council, for the upcoming period of 2026-2027. Colombia would like to make available to the international community our experience and our commitment to peace and reconciliation. Our country is proof that despite the wounds, despite the obstacles, humanity can redeem itself. Excellencies, in conclusion, my work as Foreign Affairs Minister in Colombia, as part of that, I'd like to repeat to you my commitment to peace. I will continue to be part of the government in upcoming months. I will continue to be a soldier for peace, convinced as I am that our destiny is to live without fear and in dignity. Colombia has shown that peace is not a utopia. It's a reality that is possible with enough determination and commitment. Our experience in reconciliation and solving conflicts is something that's invaluable that we'd like to share with the world. We will continue to be firm in defending life, stability and international cooperation. Together we can build a future where peace is an irreversible path for all nations. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Luis Gilberto Murillo for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.